What is up with all the boring announcements in church? I mean, seriously, I know this feeling well. You get to a church service and you're ready to get into sort of the spiritual vibe of worship, and then follows, like 3 minutes of announcements, but it feels like 7 minutes to 12 minutes of announcements, right? Because they sort of come one after the other. So what's the deal with all these announcements in church? Now, you might be thinking, well, the pastor is going to say that's why we use digital projection for announcements, because it makes them less boring. And truth be told, we are using digital projection to do some announcements. But I actually want to make the case for and defend the idea of having announcements themselves in church. So while you and I are getting into our spiritual vibe, while we're getting our mystic on, God is telling us, pay attention during announcements in church. Maybe that's an overdramatic way to put it, but I think the case can be made. Announcements are one of the very first things we do when we start a church service. There's some music, and then, the way we do it here is I get up and I welcome everyone to the worship service, and I start sharing announcements. And some of these are of spiritual interest. Some of them are very mundane and informational, and will bore you for just a couple minutes, not that long. Nevertheless, I want to say that that's appropriately part of worship service. The early Christian worship services, when Christians began gathering together to celebrate and remember Jesus' resurrection and be formed by the scriptures that we call the Old Testament and the readings of the apostles and their friends that we now call the New Testament. When early Christians began to do this, to get together to hear these readings and share communion together, this was a real community meeting. They would share what we think of as announcements. They would share about the needs of this or that person or this or that thing of common community concern. And that's important. In Hebrews 10:25, we're exhorted that we not neglect to meet together, as is the habit of some. These early Christian meetings are authentic community gatherings. Moreover, there's the whole picture of the scriptures. Ecclesia, as we've talked about, means called out, like called out of the world. It's also the word that comes in to the Greek as like gathered together. Sometimes it comes into English as congregation when translating the Old Testament. So the entire congregation, if you think of Israel journeying together through the wilderness, Israel journeys together. Israel is a congregation, a group of people that dwell together and journey together. And so many of the titles for the people of God in Scripture, like the people of God, emphasize precisely this communal nature, this corporate journeying of this pilgrim people on the way through this present time toward the city that is to come, the city with foundations. And as part of a group of people journeying together, there are announcements that need to be shared. And so what I'd invite you to is when you come to church, and I'd invite you to come worship with us or worship at a church close to you. When you worship at church, don't just tune out the announcements. Think, I'm invited. More, I'm called by God to be part of the people of God, part of this people journeying together. And those announcements concern the communal business and the shared life of the people of God. What a blessing that we have announcements. What a blessing that, as Galatians says, we can bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. God bless you, and I wish you peace, and I wish you a good journey, a bon voyage with the people of God.